Matthew was sitting at the station, waiting for the night train to get to the village where he had recently settled. The young man had no permanent home. He always had to look for a place to sleep, in abandoned buildings, near the heating main, or rent a bedroom in a dormitory. Matthew has lived on the street since he was 12. He learned one rule over the years: you can't stay in one place for a long time. It just so happened that on his 12th birthday, his mother found out about a serious disease. The disease progressed rapidly. After only a few months, she lost her battle with the disease and died. It was very hard for the boy because he loved his mother. She was his hope, his whole reason for living. The stepfather didn't care about the boy. Matthew was a burden to him. So a week after his mother's death, his stepfather got drunk and kicked the boy out on the street. Matthew didn't want to go into an orphanage, so he had to learn to survive. And by the time he was in his 20s, he knew best how to survive. The boy didn't ask for alms and earned his money without shunning any kind of work. He worked as a watchman, janitor, longshoreman, and handyman, and even cleaned up after dogs. The main thing was to get paid on time. He didn't care about the type of work, even if it was hard and dirty work. Matthew could not get any official job because he didn't have any documents. Actually, he was satisfied with that kind of life. He had no goals. His only task was to drag his miserable existence. It was the beginning of summer, and Matthew planned to stay in that abandoned hut on the outskirts of a remote village until mid-autumn. What would happen in the winter? He didn't know yet. There was no one else at the station except for him. Matthew was sitting on a bench, observing his surroundings and waiting for the train. Matthew was used to being inconspicuous, blending in with the shadows. He had once become one with the shadows. Therefore, if anyone appeared, for example, the police, they would not notice him. Suddenly, a girl stepped onto the platform, clattering her heels. She was talking on the phone to someone nervously, sobbing, holding her purse, and looking around anxiously. Matthew couldn't help admiring the girl, who looked like a real goddess in the light of the lanterns. He was surprised that such a beauty was going somewhere by train and not by expensive car. The girl was standing far enough from Matthew, but he could smell an amazing scent of perfume. It was definitely some expensive perfume. The scent revealed different flavors and didn't seem too sugary. It was delicate and pleasant. What was she doing at the station? Why was she waiting for a train? It was obvious that the girl was rich. A train light appeared in the distance. Matthew looked closer to see if it was a freight or passenger train. And then he heard a quick stomping and screeching. Matthew turned sharply toward the girl and opened his eyes wide. At that very moment, someone pushed her onto the railroad tracks. The guy caught his breath and stood up. The criminal stood still for a few seconds, looking down at his victim. He probably wanted to see if she could get up and try to save herself. Or should he hit her over the head with something to make sure she couldn't get up? Matthew suddenly cried out in horror. Frightened, the criminal turned around nervously. The light of the nearest lantern fell so that Matthew could clearly see the criminal's face. But Matthew was still in the shadows, and the criminal couldn't see him. At least, that's what Matthew thought. Realizing they weren't alone, the criminal immediately ran away. Matthew wanted to chase him and seize him, but he realized that the girl was still on the rails and the train was getting close. The guy had no choice, so he rushed to the rescue with a beautiful stranger. The girl was lying unconscious on the rails. The rails were deep down and the train was getting closer. It was impossible to push her aside. Tired after an exhausting workday, Matthew jumped to the girl and tried to lift her up. The train driver began frantically honking the horn. By the grinding of the wheels, it was clear that he activated the emergency stop. But it was a freight train, so there was no way the train could stop in time. When he finally pushed the girl out, Matthew barely had time to get out himself. Just a few seconds of delay, and he would have been dead. The train passed them. Shocked by what happened a second ago, Matthew collapsed next to the girl and relaxed for a moment. But he realized in time that the driver had probably already reported the accident, and the police would be here soon. So he had to pull himself together, got to his feet, and get out of there. Limping, Matthew made his way to the park, sat down on a bench, and put his arms around his head. He couldn't get to the village now, and there was no strength left to look for a new place to sleep. Matthew lay down on the bench and fell asleep, thinking that this time he could sleep longer because he would not have to get up early in the morning to catch the first train and arrive on time for work. Several days passed. All this time, Matthew was not himself because he could clearly see the face of the man who had tried to kill the girl. Maybe he could help the police find the criminal, but he did not want to get involved with them. He already had enough problems. One day, the guy decided to take a day off because he was tired, both physically and mentally. Lying in an abandoned hut on a shabby couch, he kept thinking, what was the right thing to do? After all, bad people must be punished. That man could try to get rid of the girl again, but in a different way. Relaxing, Matthew closed his eyes and hoped he could fall asleep. However, the next second he heard the flimsy front door being kicked in with a loud thud. Matthew immediately rushed to the window, but he had no time to escape because all the windows in the hut were boarded up. When he realized he was trapped, Matthew stared at the two huge men who had entered the room and were looking at him with amused faces. "Finally, we found you," said one of them. They captured Matthew, tied his hands behind his back, and put a bag over his head. There was only one thought running through his head. This is the revenge of the criminal that Matthew stopped from committing the murder. When they dragged him to the car, he was scared. However, Matthew tried to calm himself. He had saved a human life after all, and he didn't care if the price for it was his life. His life was worthless anyway, but at least he had done one good deed on this planet, and now it was time to go to another world. Matthew would never have dared to say goodbye to life, but now life was saying goodbye to him. It was even better this way, he thought. From the chatter of the men who shoved him into the car, Matthew thought that they were taking him to some woods. He prayed to God that his death would be quick, not long and painful. How long had they been driving? Matthew didn't know. He regretted not going to the police and helping them find the criminal. Matthew thought he had not been careful enough, because on that fateful day, he was sure it was impossible to see his face in the dark. He was probably mistaken. Breathing heavily, he imagined what his death might be like. When the car stopped, Matthew tensed up. A few seconds later, he was dragged out of the car. There were birds singing all around and it smelled fresh. They were in the woods. However, as they began to push him up the steps, the guy realized he was wrong again. It wasn't the woods, it was the house. Or maybe he was about to be pushed off some cliff. Probably not, since they hadn't climbed high enough. "Michael King, we've got him," one of the big guys shouted. A few minutes later, Matthew heard shuffling footsteps and a shout that made his ears ring. "What have you done, idiots?" shouted a middle-aged man. Matthew determined his age by his voice. "What did I tell you to do? To bring him here. Why did you tie him up and put a bag over his head?" "For safety, Mr. King. You didn't give us any instructions. You just told us to find him by any means and bring him to you. Well, we found him by any means." They made excuses. "Untie him, now!" Matthias was set free, and he could see that he was in a luxury mansion. And the man standing in front of him was probably the owner of this mansion. He was probably rich. "Look, my friend, I don't know your name, but we don't want to hurt you. I invited you here with good intentions." That's a fun way to invite someone. A thought popped into Matthew's head that made him laugh. "My name is Matthew," he cautiously introduced himself. "Nice to meet you, Matthew. My name is Michael King." After giving Matthew an appraising look, Michael sniffed and grimaced. "Look, Matthew, why don't you go take a shower, put on some clean clothes, and then they'll walk you to my office where we'll talk, okay? And please don't try to escape. It's impossible. But believe me, I don't want to hurt you." A young girl approached Matthew. Apparently, she was a maid. She escorted him to the guest room, giving him clean clothes and a towel. Matthew had not showered in days. He washed his face every day at work, but there were no showers. He had never even dreamed of taking a bath. However, he wasn't thinking about a bath right now. He didn't want to keep the stranger waiting. After shaving, showering, and changing his clothes, Matthew looked at himself in the mirror and smiled. He suddenly thought he looked like the prince from the fairy tales. No one would have guessed that he was homeless. Now he could easily seduce any girl. But he suddenly remembered that he was actually in captivity, even though Mr. King had tried to convince him of his good intentions. If this was the same man who tried to kill the girl, perhaps he would ask Matthew to finish the job. After all, he'd already prevented getting rid of her once. It got scary, but the guy already knew what his answer would be. Let them kill him if they wanted, but he wouldn't hurt the girl. Going downstairs, he made his way to the office of the master of the house. "Man, you're looking much better." Michael smiled, but immediately got serious. "You know it was hard to find you. There's no record of you anywhere. It's like you don't even exist. But you know there are cameras everywhere in the city, and we used them to track you. You saved my daughter, so now you can ask me anything you want. Within reason, of course." Matthew exhaled with relief. He was still trembling with fear, but it was easier now. The boy decided that he would feel much better if he told Michael what he saw in the face of the criminal. But they didn't have a chance to talk, because that's when someone entered the office. and when Matthew saw him, he was terrified. He couldn't even move, thinking that they were going to kill him after all. "Who is this guy?" the stranger asked. "It's..." Michael was about to start explaining, but Matthew shook his head frantically, looking into Michael's eyes. Matthew stood behind the stranger and gesticulated vigorously, begging Michael not to tell the truth. "It's our new gardener, interviewing him." Michael frowned, but he frowned, not understanding why Matthew had such a reaction. After a few words with the stranger, Michael King asked him to wait for a while. As soon as he was alone with Matthew again, he stared at him questioningly. "Tell me, why did you react like that? This is my deputy, Peter." "It's him. He pushed your daughter onto the rails." Matthew forced himself to say, "That's why I wanted to tell you. I remembered the criminal's face. He didn't see me, probably because I was in the shadows. I couldn't go to the police because I have no ID, and I didn't want any problems. But I thought about it all the time. I couldn't sleep." "What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind?" Michael King exclaimed, not believing Matthew. "Think before you say anything. Are you even sure of your accusations? He's my right hand. I trust him more than I trust myself. You need very strong evidence to accuse a respectable man like Peter." "I have something." Michael began nervously rummaging through his pockets. Finding the gold cufflink he'd picked up on the platform when he rescued the girl, the boy held it out to Michael. "I'm not sure if it belongs to him, but I think this is something that fell off when the girl tried to grab that criminal's hand. She must have ripped that cufflink off his hand. I wanted to sell it, but my conscience wouldn't let me." Michael King went pale. For a couple of minutes, he twisted the cufflinks tensely in his hands. "I gave it to him as a present. I bought them from Russia. This is how he decided to thank me for everything I did for him." Michael King called his guards and told them to drag Peter to his office. Michael tried to justify himself and was indignant that he was being treated like some kind of thief because he had done nothing wrong. However, Michael King's guards loosened his tongue and forced him to tell the truth. Matthew found it hard to watch his torture, but he rejoiced that the criminal would get what he deserved. Peter confessed that he really did it. Victoria, Michael King's daughter, had not long ago announced that she was going to marry her boyfriend, who was a simple guy. Peter realized that this wedding would be the end for him, because then it would not be him who would get to run Mr. King's company when he retired, but his son-in-law, whom the man planned to teach. A loser working in some factory would run his company. Peter could not let that happen. He thought long and hard about how to prevent the wedding, but it was impossible to break up the lovers because they were inseparable. And then he decided to take this terrible step. After learning that Victoria's fiancé was leaving to prepare a surprise for his bride, and he certainly would be out of cell phone range, Peter called Victoria, changing his voice, and informed her that her fiancé had problems. She must bring money to the station if she wanted to see him alive again. The man figured out the time when the freight train would be passing by, so he told the girl to come to the station at that exact time. "I had it all planned out to the last detail." Peter growled angrily. "Except I didn't take into account that some tramp might ruin everything." Peter spat blood on the carpet. Michael King clenched his hands into fists. First, he looked at his deputy, at his former deputy, and then he turned his gaze to his guards. "Guys, I know you didn't like him. Take him to the woods and teach him a lesson he will always remember, and make sure that he will regret what he did for the rest of his life." Peter started begging for mercy, but Michael King wouldn't listen. When the guards took the criminal away, Michael King apologized to Matthew for having witnessed the whole thing. In gratitude for saving his daughter from death, then helping find the culprit, Michael King helped Matthew to get an ID. He also bought him an apartment and paid his tuition, promising that after graduation, he would hire Matthew to work for his company. "You can start as a janitor first, and then we'll see." King Matthew laughed through his sadness. "With great pleasure. Thank you very much." Matthew never tired of thanking him. "Well, I was only joking about the janitor, but it's commendable that you're willing to do any job." Matthew was the guest of honor at Victoria's wedding, where the groom thanked him and gave him the keys to his old but solid car. But Matthew couldn't use a gift yet because he had a lot of things to learn, including driving. But he was happy to do it because now his life made some sense.